Well, hello, we're here with Judy Heumann. I'm Virginia Knowlton Marcus. I'm a white woman with short brown hair and teal colored glasses and top on and black pants. And I'm wearing a scarf around my neck that is also teal and yellow. And Judy, I'd like to start by saying how long and much I've admired your inner wisdom and strength of conviction. You've surmounted so many barriers and stared down intimidation and discrimination starting from when you were a kid in New York, denied an education, and a young adult denied the opportunity to become an educator. And you really quickly recognized that you were not the problem. The world needed to change. Meanwhile, so many people with disabilities seem to be hampered by internalized ableism and stigma. And so I know you've given a lot of credit to your parents, but I'd like to hear some of the other factors that have developed your clarity of purpose and your courageous leadership.
First of all, thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate it. For the audience, I'm a 74-year-old white disabled woman. I have brown hair with highlights that I got put in when I went to the Oscars last year because someone who did makeup and hair said, "Oh, you've got to put in highlights." So I did. And today I'm wearing a little jacket with black rim and pink and black. I'm wearing like aubergine pants in my motorized wheelchair. So the reason I've always talked about my mother and father so much is because I had polio when I was 18 months old in 1949. So obviously I had no authority or knowledge or capacity at such a young age to really be able to influence what was happening to me. And in many ways, when people ask me who my role model is or who my role models were, I frequently will talk about my parents because we're Jewish, we're German Jews. My parents were sent out of Germany when they were 12 and 14. My mom was an only child, so she was sent to live with a distant relative that she didn't know. My dad was 14 when he was sent out, but he went to Brooklyn and he knew a number of the relatives there. So my mother really, at 12, was on her own. And the family that she lived with I never met them, but they were a caring, loving family. But nonetheless, they didn't speak German. I don't think my mother didn't speak English in the beginning. So when I started thinking about who made a difference in my life, it was my parents who really said things like, when the doctor said they should institutionalize me when I was 2, and they made the decision not to do that. I was the oldest. My brother had been born like a month after I had polio and was in the hospital. So my parents could have made different decisions. And then, they decided, I'm sure very quickly, that they had no intention of putting me in an institution and really saw their responsibility to be good parents. And like many parents, you prepare your kids to go to school and you frequently take them to school their first day of school. So my mother took me to school to register me and was informed by the principal that I was a fire hazard and couldn't go to that school. And I remember, clearly being disappointed, but obviously not really understanding what was going on. So I never went to kindergarten. When I was 6, I still didn't get into school, but the Board of Ed in Brooklyn started sending a teacher to the house. So that was for the first, second, third, and half of the 4th grade. And my mother continually was looking for places to try to get me into school. So it was this consistent, persistent drumbeat that really allowed me to begin to learn at a very early age about advocacy. And my mother was a networker, like from when I had polio. So she was in her 9th month pregnancy. And the way they were able to do that is they had friends in the neighborhood and neighbors would take care of my brother when she was going to the hospital because I was in the hospital for a fair amount of time. And my dad worked full time. So a lot of the characteristics that I have very much go back to my mother and my father, to a degree also, a little bit more on steroids. And I think for me, this natural progression was impacted by the fact that when I did finally start going to school, it was with other disabled kids in a regular school, but classes I went to had only disabled children. And there I was beginning to learn much more graphically about low expectations. In many ways, it's not that people had low expectations for me, but the class that I first went into when I was 9 had some children that were my age, and other classes had kids younger, and then kids who were 15, 16, 17, 18 years old in a school for non-disabled kids, which ended at 6th grade. So it was very clear, although unclear because I was 9, that what was going on wasn't correct. And I think that really, I remember pretty early on going over to Joni Lapadula and Jill Kirshner and trying to help them learn how to read more. And I was like 9 or 10. So it was this continually thinking that people could do more than other people thought they could do. But for me, when I think about working with these kids on trying to learn how to read more, that kind of makes me feel like a part of who I really am. It's like looking at what more can be done when it seems like other people have given up.
You talk about your Board of Education case in your excellent book, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist. And the book also details your Section 504 activism that's so vividly depicted in Crip Camp, as well as passage of the ADA, your work at the World Bank, and as U.S. Department of State Special Advisor for International Disability Rights, and even how you met your husband, Jorge. And you wrote this book together with Christian Joyner. And you recently wrote another book together called Rolling Warrior, the incredible, sometimes awkward, true story of a rebel girl on wheels who helped spark a revolution. Can you please tell us about that book or these books and their significance?
So Rolling Warrior is an outgrowth of Being Human. It's very similar. It's just got some changes in it so that it's more readable for a younger audience, younger meaning 10 to 12 years old. But we did the book because people for many years I'm a storyteller. So anybody, like you who knows me and has heard me speak, I always tell stories because I think it makes it real, because my stories are not atypical. Some of them may be a little bit different, but there's always somebody who's had a similar experience. And I think stories, not just in the area of disability, but when you're trying to get people to relate to something, whether it's serious or funny, and I'm not very funny, although people say I'm very sarcastic and I make people laugh, but that I find that it evokes better discussions, because people then start thinking about their stories, even if it's not the same situation. But so people were like, oh, you've got to write a book. And no, I'm really not a strong writer. I'm a much stronger speaker. So it was at the end of the Obama administration. And I was approached by a group of people who were interested in the book and having me write the book. And so we ultimately agreed that they would help me find a writer and an agent. And we did, and kind of history. So Kristen and I had never met each other, but I think it was in June of 2017 that we did meet in person and liked each other and decided that she didn't have a disability, she still doesn't. But I liked the way she thought. And I knew in the beginning that it was going to be challenging because as a non-disabled person, she really, she's a progressive thinker, but nonetheless didn't really understand disability. But I think in the end, we learned a lot from each other. And for me, the book strikes the balance that I wanted, where people very frequently talk about how they related to the stories, particularly disabled people who can talk about that. But non-disabled people, I think, also very much relate to it. And one of the important parts about this book and the other book and the film, Crip Camp, which I was also in, is the common comment of how come we didn't know this story. And it's not how come we didn't know the story of Judy Heumann. It's how come we didn't know the story of the disability rights movement, its history, its evolution, its revolution. So I think the book and the books, and I'm working on a book right now with 2 other disabled women for children 4 to 8. So interesting time.
Yeah. And I'm going to pick up the thread of the learning to be assertive, because I know as a result of the lawsuit we were talking about, you were thrust into a media spotlight at a very young age and at a time when disabled people were essentially invisible in the media. And then fast forward to a couple of years ago when you actually wrote the white paper, The Road to Inclusion, Changing the Face of Disability in the Media. So can you talk to us a little bit about how your experience with and perception of the media has evolved over the years?
It's a great question. So as you were saying, I was out of college, so I was like 22, I think. And I was denied my right to teach. And then a group of us started, thinking about what we needed to do. And I get a friend of mine at that point who was doing some work with the New York Times, a disabled guy, got the person who wrote the article, Malcolm, to write this piece, which I didn't know anything about. So it came out on a Wednesday, and the next day, the editorial came out in the New York Times. And that same day, I got a call from the Today Show. And I was like, I've never been on TV. And I've never been on TV nationally. And should I do this? And that did take me a second to say, of course, you're going to do it. And I think there was something about not really being able to be prepared. And I just thought, I'm not going to lose this opportunity, that stuck with me forever. One day I was working in California and I was invited to a meeting with the governor, Governor Brown. And I remember thinking the same thing, that he was no different than me and no different than us. And I shouldn't be treating anybody any differently, and just do and say what you think, politely, firmly. But I think it was very much due to what happened, as you said, as a result of the media attention.
And it's kind of interesting that it seems like early in your career, you focused more on legal rights advocacy and then have pivoted to communications advocacy. There's the books, the movie Crip Camp, and your podcast, your excellent podcast, The Human Perspective. And, as you mentioned, I still think that despite all this great work, it still seems like outside of our own community, the disability rights movement is the greatest story never told. And I'd like to hear your perspective on penetrating mainstream media.
It's a great question. And I mean, I would say that I always have felt media was very important. And the issue of being able to penetrate media is something that I was involved with. So in New York, with the lawsuit, we set up a group called Disabled in Action. And we, for example, had a demonstration outside of the New York Times because they just would not cover disability on any page but health, science, and socialite pages. And so at that point, we were already looking at what do we need to do to get people to look at this issue as a rights-based issue. And one of the disadvantages that we had and still significantly have is that we don't have enough people with disabilities who are really a part of mainstream media. I mean, in media, depending on the medium that you're using, being able to be objective is very important. However, women, Black people, Latinos, on and on, when they are in different positions, it is a part of who they are. Their background is a part of who they are. And I think that very much is reflected in the way people do investigations, in the way they sit around a table and explore ideas of things that need to happen, people that should be interviewed, themes and topics that should be discussed. And the absence of that, I think, is still a major issue. So while we are definitely seeing small progress, and I know sometimes people are like, oh, don't call it small because you can name this movie and that movie, and there are more disabled people who are now showing up in films and television, etc. But still, I am looking forward to the day when you look at major talk shows, for example, whether it be MSNBC or CNN or Fox or whatever you're looking at, that when people are being brought in to discuss issues that have acknowledged and expertise in disability would be a great part of those discussions.
But I appreciate the communications advocacy work you're doing, because all these years in legal advocacy, and we win victories, and that's just sort of the beginning of the work, right? But really all we can do is sort of change people's behavior, right? It's telling our stories that will really change people's hearts and minds. So that's, for example, one reason why Disability Rights North Carolina is pleased to partner with Arts Access to bring Crip Camp to a wider audience, because I just think the arts are a great tool for advancing disability justice.
Advancing discussions. I mean, I think I completely agree with you. So my doing more work in the area of media really came about in kind of a fluky way. So when Secretary Clinton lost for presidency, I was intending to be working in her administration. And so I didn't have a job. And so when I needed to start thinking about what I could do, I was old enough to retire, but I have no interest in retiring. So I started setting up a company, and it was about the same time as the Ford Foundation started to do more work in the area of disability, where that relatively new president at that time, Darren Walker, he called me one day and asked if I would be interested in being a senior fellow at the foundation. And of course, I was very humbled and surprised by that. And he said, you can do anything that you want. And so I thought, okay, let's look at the issue of media and representation. I think we can certainly see changes that are going on, but where we want to be as a community, we're not there yet.
No, we're not. But talk about great representation in Crip Camp. I still believe that it should have won the Oscar for Best Documentary last year. But you show up in this film as a camp counselor. And I don't think I've ever heard the story about how you came to have that job. What is your Camp Jened backstory?
So I had been a camper at Jened, probably for about 4 or 5 years, from when I was like 12 or 13. I'd gone to another camp earlier, Camp Oakhurst, and Camp Jened, you could stay longer. So it's one of the reasons why I went there. And, because it was when I was a teenager, it was a real great opportunity to spend time with some teenagers that I didn't know and some that I knew from school, and to really begin to think more about our futures, like other kids that age were doing. but we didn't really have many disabled role models who had graduated high school, gone to college, or getting jobs. We didn't know that age group yet. And so, going to camp was an opportunity to explore, to create, to gain confidence. And I think between camp and camp, during the school year, it was an opportunity for me at least to begin to explore a little bit more about areas of interest. I loved the camp because it had given me so much and I'd made so many friends. So it was a good next step.
I could go on all day talking to you. I don't want to talk too much more about Crip Camp because I really don't want to be a spoiler. I want people to just watch the movie. So it's always so good to see and hear from you. Do you have any last comments to share with our audience?
I just think that it's important for people to not only read the books and look at Crip Camp, but to read other people's books, to look at what's going on in our elementary schools or high schools or universities as far as inclusion of history and social studies in the area of disability. I think disability is something everybody needs to be thinking about because we're all hoping to become older. And one of the things that goes on sometimes when you're older is that you have a visual disability, auditory, or both, a physical disability, some memory issues. And if we're planning for our future, we can be looking more proactively at how is the housing in our communities being constructed? What is the community-based services or personal assistance that you may need in your home in order to stay in your home? How much money do I have? Does Medicare or Medicaid help me get any of these benefits? And to really engage much earlier so that when you're 60, 65, 70, 75, you don't find yourself in a situation where you can't stay in your home, you bought a place you shouldn't have bought. And equally importantly, I think to really work with your state and local governments on things like what are the standards that are required to be used for new construction?
Yes.
Just as an example. So I want the audience to be engaged, speak up, speak out, and to look at what you're doing in your daily lives, whether or not you're a part of a solution in your communities and your businesses, to really ensuring that disabled people can be employed, can speak up if they have invisible disabilities without fear of retribution.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
It's great.
Yeah, this was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.